Hi, everyone. It's Dylan Williams, Director of Government Affairs here at J Street. We are very pleased on this eventful morning to be joined by, I work with Barbara on a number of things, and I'm very pleased that she's agreed to join us today to share her expertise. She is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center and Washington correspondent for ALMonitor.com, a website devoted to news from and about the Middle East. The author of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and the Twisted Path to Confrontation, she is a regular commentator on U.S. foreign policy and Iran on NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN. A career journalist, Barbara previously served as assistant managing editor for world and national security of the Washington Times, senior diplomatic reporter for USA Today, Cairo correspondent for The Economist, and as an editor at the New York Times Week in Review. She has covered such key foreign policy issues as the U.S.-led war on terrorism, policy toward rogue states, the Iran-Iraq war, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. She has traveled to Iran 9 times, most recently to report on the inauguration of Iran's new president, Hassan Rouhani. Slavin also served as a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where she wrote Bitter Friends, and as senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she researched and wrote the report, Mullahs, Money, and Militias, How Iran Exerts Its Influence in the Middle East. Barbara, thanks so much for being here with us this morning.
My pleasure.
Now, I'm sure everyone's eager to hear about the details of what just took place in Vienna, but I actually want to lay some groundwork first. I want you, if you could, to take us back about a year before there was an interim agreement. What did Iran's nuclear program look like, and what did the diplomatic effort to address it look like back then?
Well, of course, before the Iran was enriching uranium to 20% U-235. That's the isotope that, if you get enough of it, you can make a bomb from it. There were inspections of Iran's nuclear facilities, but not on a daily basis. They were once a week or less often. Some of Iran's facilities were not being inspected at all. Iran was also working on a heavy water reactor at a place called Arak, A-R-A-K, not the country, that, if completed, could have potentially produced plutonium, which is another ingredient that one can use to make nuclear weapons. So the Iranian program was moving smartly along toward that famous cartoon bomb of Bibi Netanyahu at the UN a few years ago. If you remember, he drew a red line across this cartoonish bomb and said, if Iran gets to this level, you know, then we're all in trouble. Iran was moving very smartly toward that line.
And what did the diplomatic effort look like up to that point on the part of the P5+1 in the United States? Was it robust? Was it plodding? How would you describe it?
Well, the change really occurred after Hassan Rouhani was elected Iran's president in 2013. So the process resumed in September of 2013. And what is remarkable, especially as we look at the events of today, is that in just a couple of months, the parties reconvened what had been rather lackluster talks, frankly, and got to this interim agreement called the Joint Plan of Action, the JPOA. That was quite rapid. In return, Iran got some sanctions relief, although not a great deal, and a process was started of regular high-level talks between Iranian officials, American officials, and others from the rest of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. So what we saw was really quite remarkable progress at the beginning. Unfortunately, that process has not led to the comprehensive accord that many of us hoped we would see.
That's right. So what did take place today in Vienna? What was announced today after a particularly intense round of negotiations?
They didn't get there. Look, they tried very hard. According to Secretary of State John Kerry, they made some substantial progress in certain crucial areas. He didn't reveal the details. I imagine some of them will spill out, if not in the American press, then in the Iranian press in the next few days. But frankly, what was a little bit disheartening to me is that they announced such a long extension of the interim agreement. Many of us had been expecting perhaps a month or two to finalize a deal, but instead Kerry announced an extension for 7 months. And this suggests to me that the gaps are still quite significant between the two sides, that they've given themselves this amount of time. Now, on the positive side, the interim agreement is extended, and that means all the restrictions on Iran that were placed there a year ago. Iran will not enrich beyond 5% U-235. The daily inspections of its enrichment facilities will continue. It will not develop large stockpiles of low-enriched uranium. It will convert them to a form that is less readily able to be used to be enriched further. Various other provisions that were put in place. And in return, it's going to get a little bit more sanctions relief, probably another $5 billion over the course of the agreement. But it's disappointing because I know certainly the expectations were very high in Iran that they would reach a deal and that they would get substantive, comprehensive sanctions relief. On our side, it's also worrisome because Congress, as we know, is going to be led by the Republicans come January. And many of the most influential Republican senators are already on the record saying that they're going to push for new sanctions now, that they're not going to be content with an extension of the interim agreement. Secretary Kerry at his press conference addressed an appeal to Congress not to sabotage the interim deal, but we're getting close to a presidential election year. It's going to be very, very difficult, I think, for Congress to restrain itself. One other point that's also disappointing for me is that if we'd gotten a comprehensive deal now, that would have given us a couple of years under President Obama to see its implementation. Now, if there is an agreement, there will be less time for an agreement to prove itself under President Obama before a change in the White House that could potentially bring in someone who is much harder line on the issue of Iran and its nuclear program.
Right, right. Back on the features of what the next 7 months might look like. Recall something in Secretary Kerry's announcement about this being a two-staged time period, that they were seeking a political agreement in 4 months and then to finalize that in the subsequent 3 months. What's your opinion about that? How rigid do you think that timeline is?
Well, given how unrigid the November 24th deadline turned out to be, I shouldn't think this is very rigid.
Right.
Maybe it's just a way of making the extension look less long. I don't really understand why March for the political agreement and then an extra few months for the rest of it. Again, you know, it looks a little bit like a kind of political massaging, a bit of spin for what was a failure to reach a comprehensive agreement.
On the issue of Congress and the pressure it's going to apply, when the interim agreement first came out in November and then was finalized in January, there were a number of members of Congress, others, some in Israel, predicting that Iran would never comply with the terms of that agreement. Secretary Kerry today described Iran as in compliance with the terms of that agreement. Is that accurate? Where were the areas of concern, and you know, can we expect Iran to, for so long as the negotiations are maintained over the next 7 months, continue to comply with its obligations?
Yes, I believe Iran will continue to comply, but that is assuming that there aren't new sanctions that are slapped on Iran. And this is a warning to the Congress, obviously, that you know, obviously President Obama can veto new sanctions, but if they try to remove his waiver authority or they try to attach sanctions to a must-pass bill, for example, like the defense authorization, something like that, the Iranians could retaliate by restricting access to some of their facilities or starting to enrich to higher levels. I mean, this is a deal that only works if both sides or all sides comply with it. So I'm sure the administration will use that argument with Congress, and we'll have to see how successful.
So we have our hardliners here. They also have their hardliners there. Can you describe a little bit about the Iranian domestic politics that might be affecting the range of action of both their government and the P5+1 on this?
Yeah, again, that's another cause for concern. So far, the negotiators have had a fair amount of space, but Foreign Minister Zarif has plenty of enemies in Iran who think he's already too conciliatory, that he's too American. You know, he spent more than half his life in this country, and that's not lost on less well-traveled Iranians, shall we say, in the parliament in particular. They could try to impeach him. They could do other things to make life difficult. They could seize more American hostages. They could stir the pot even more in the Middle East, do things to really sour the atmosphere for a deal. The supreme leader of the country has been behind the implementation of the interim agreement. I presume will remain so, but you know, His health is in question. He has had surgery for cancer, and no one quite knows, whether he will be robust enough to continue for a long time. There are a lot of imponderables. I worry also just about the mood in society, because I know people were counting on this deal in order to get real sanctions relief so that Western businesses would be able to return, so the economy would really revive. How will Iranians react? Will they protest? Will that lead to new crackdowns on popular opinion and on civil society? What will happen to President Rouhani? The power of his presidency has rested on trying to get a nuclear deal. And he got a boost with the interim agreement. Will he now lose clout because they haven't been able to cross the finish line? So frankly, there are a lot of causes for concern on both sides.
And what about our P5+1 partners? Sometimes, in quotes, obviously China always complicated relationships with the United States. But over the past couple of days, when it was noted that Secretary Kerry had gone for meetings with his Iranian counterpart to his French counterpart, a number of people said, now the real negotiations begin. What are the calculations and red lines, if you will, of even some of our closest allies on this?
Well, I should think that the Europeans will continue to abide by the sanctions. It's in their interest, I believe, to do so, as long as Iran abides by its part of this agreement. I'm more concerned about what the Russians and the Chinese do. If these talks go on and on and on without a resolution, I would expect that the Russians might break ranks, in particular because they are themselves under sanctions because of their actions in Ukraine. And there are deals that they could do with the Iranians that would bust sanctions. The Chinese also might be tempted to do more business with Iran, to break the sanctions, to buy more oil from Iran. Now, the world oil market is in a rather advantageous situation from the point of view of buyers, not sellers. But Iran, in its desperation, may try to tempt the Chinese with even lower prices. And they could break ranks as well. The longer this goes on, the more there is opportunity for sabotage.
And given that there's such difficulty in figuring out what exactly is happening in these negotiations, and that may be a good thing or a bad thing, what should we be looking for in the coming weeks in terms of results from the negotiations themselves or actions by either Iran or the P5+1 parties, which will tell us whether things are going well or things are going not so well?
Well, there will be more technical talks. Secretary Kerry announced that the technical experts will meet again in December. And he did say, as I said, there was some progress on certain areas, and this is technically a very complex negotiation. Different formulas lead to different ways of resolving the problem of preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons by cutting off that there are to a bomb and increasing the so-called breakout period, which is, of course, the goal of the P5+1. Different ways also of easing sanctions. Again, we don't know how much progress has already been made and how big the gap is, but it's reasonable to assume that they're still haggling over the number and types of centrifuges, the schedule for lifting sanctions, and the duration of the agreement.
There is a lot of focus on centrifuge numbers and types of centrifuges. How much weight should we put on that, and when is its relevance important compared to other factors like monitoring and verification, heavy water reactor?
Well, my own personal view is that the number is less important than the verification and what happens to the stockpiles of low enriched uranium that Iran continues to churn out. There were reports before the talks that the Russians had agreed to take the stockpile of low enriched uranium and turn it into fuel for civilian reactors, which seemed like an excellent formula. Apparently that wasn't good enough, though, because the US and others are still insisting that Iran come down on the numbers of centrifuges from 10,200 currently operating to around 4,500. And I'm just assuming now, this is just a guess, I'm not privy to the, what went on in those rooms, but I'm just guessing that the Iranians couldn't come down low enough to meet the demands of the Europeans and the United States.
We're going to turn now to some questions from supporters and viewers of this podcast. So I'd like to first turn to a question from David Keppel, who asks, Prime Minister Netanyahu told the BBC that any deal must dismantle, in quotes, Iran's nuclear program. Mr. Keppel asks, aren't there less humiliating and more negotiable alternatives that would greatly reduce the risk of an Iranian bomb?
Yes, indeed. And the word dismantle is not going to figure in any comprehensive agreement if we ever get there. It's a humiliating word, and it suggests that Iran's investment in this nuclear program, which of course goes back to the days of the Shah, has been completely wasted and squandered, and Iran should somehow erase the program and pretend that it never existed. It's not going to happen. So when Bibi Netanyahu says that, he's being deliberately provocative. He prefers no deal. It's not a question of a good deal or a bad deal to him. He prefers no deal because he doesn't want to see the U.S. and Iran have a better relationship, for one. He doesn't want to see Iran retain any of its infrastructure and have substantial sanctions relief. He worries about Iran's role in the region, and he has every right to do so. But he has to ask himself whether sanctions are going to erode and Iran would at some point resume this program in an accelerated fashion, and whether that's better for Israeli interests than a deal that puts significant curbs on the Iranian program for a decade or more. So that's how I would interpret his comments.
How do you regard the prospects or the possibility of, let's say, a more, what people describe as a kinetic option, perhaps an Israeli military strike? What would the impact be on Iran's nuclear program? What would the impact be on the diplomatic arena, including Israel and the United States' standing vis-a-vis its allies?
No, I tend not to believe that the kinetic option is a real one. Iran's program is too big, it's too well protected, and of course Iran could reconstitute this program. You're not going to be able to bomb the knowledge out of the heads of Iranian scientists, however many scientists you kill. And of course we know that their scientists have been assassinated, a number of them, including several recently in Syria. So I don't see a kinetic option. I think that that's used as a way to put pressure on the international community to maintain sanctions against Iran, which have had an impact.
And in terms of the region as it is now, obviously a number of conflicts going on and some overlapping, if not alliances, at least interests, shall we say, ISIS and others. What do you think the impact of the current turmoil in the region will be on the next 7 months negotiation? And then to flip it a bit, if we can reach a comprehensive agreement in that time, how would that impact some of the other conflicts that are occurring?
Well, this is another one of my concerns, because had we been able to reach a comprehensive agreement, I think it would have opened the door to more cooperation between the United States and Iran on a number of regional issues, Iraq, Syria, for example. And now the tacit cooperation will continue, but overt cooperation will be more difficult. The only positive there, on the other hand, is that there will be a lot more excuses for Kerry and Zarif to meet, assuming Zarif remains the foreign minister. And they and other officials can always talk about these issues on the margins of nuclear negotiations. So, the contacts will continue. But when Rouhani was at the UN in September, he was really looking forward to a kind of dramatic change in the relationship, and we're not going to see that now.
Understood. Let me just turn to my colleagues and see if we have any more questions. We do. Fantastic. Norman Robbins asks via email, how can the U.S. ensure Iran does not build clandestine enrichment weapon sites, /enrichment or weapon sites?
That's a very good question. The best way to ensure that is to have a very robust inspection regime for the declared sites, and an ability to go to other places if you get intelligence through other means, satellite or human intelligence, that Iran has a covert facility. All of this would be facilitated by a comprehensive agreement. Without it, we have the current system in place, but Iran will not ratify something called the Additional Protocol of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and other measures that it has reportedly been willing to take. So, we are better off with a comprehensive deal than without. We're better off with the interim accord than with no accord at all.
While we're on the subject of weapons themselves, can you break down for us this confusion surrounding the issue of PMDs, possible military dimensions? Where does it come from? Is it actually part of the joint plan of action, the interim agreement? What impact is it having on our ability to get to a comprehensive deal?
Yeah, no, this could have been one of the stumbling blocks. Again, we don't know. Iran promised under the interim agreement to resolve these issues. It didn't say exactly when, but it said it would. And there have been some detailed discussions between the International Atomic Energy Agency and Iran over about 12 questions that they have over past military research, allegedly took place in the late 1990s through 2003. The head of the IEA, Yuki Amano, said that he didn't expect that there would be much progress until there was a comprehensive agreement. So the fact that we don't have a comprehensive agreement leads me to believe that these issues also will be put off and that the Iranians will continue to drag their feet on answering any questions about possible military dimensions.
A few more coming in.
Okay.
An interesting and timely one. Will the resignation of Secretary Hagel have a serious impact on talks? Any potential replacements that would significantly change or impact strategy?
I don't think it will, although I will say that Chuck Hagel, when he was a senator, like Joe Biden and John Kerry, all met Javad Zarif when he was Iran's ambassador to the UN, and they were all in the Senate. And so Chuck Hagel, he actually co-chaired my task force on Iran at the Atlantic Council, and was somebody who was always very supportive of these negotiations. So I don't know. I would assume that whoever comes in to replace him would follow the administration's policies on the issue and certainly wouldn't stand in the way of an agreement. But whoever it is will lack that personal understanding of the Iran issue and the knowledge that Chuck Hagel developed through his contacts with people like Javad Zarif. So I think it's a loss, actually, a little bit of a loss to the process.
Right. Aside from the pure constitutional legislative tools that the president has, for example, exercising a veto if Congress does try to move new sanctions, what other things could the president be doing here to give diplomacy the best chance for working?
You know, I think he just has to appeal to the American public constantly, you know, to understand that as long as this interim agreement is in place, as John Kerry said, the world is a safer place, and it is. And so, why jeopardize that? You know, just to score political points in an election year or a presidential election year. Well, that's of course never stopped Congress in the past. But in terms of U.S. national security, we are better off with this interim deal than with no deal. So I hope and assume he and other administration officials will make that argument with Congress. We'll see how successful it is.
It seems to me on the politics of this that a year ago, when it came to defending and implementing the interim agreement, the American public was solidly behind the administration and against those who wanted to do something like pass new sanctions that would frustrate diplomacy, but could also lead to another military engagement in the Middle East, still very much fresh on Americans' minds. Now we're in a situation where we do have yet another military engagement in the Middle East, albeit one that is, at this point, much smaller than, I presume, a military engagement with Iran would be. Do you think that has changed American views at all?
Well, I think given what's going on now in the region, Americans would be even more reluctant to start a war with Iran. After all, the Iranians are helping the Iraqi government against the group that calls itself the Islamic State. So why on earth would you attack a country that's actually, acting on the same side in Iraq? Syria, of course, is a slightly different matter, but there as well, the Iranians are opposed anyway to the Islamic State, even though they support the Assad government. No, I don't think the American people are going to become more hawkish on Iran. Again, as long as the current interim agreement is in place, I think most people will be satisfied with that. But it would be great if we could get to another level.
As you may know, we polled Jewish American voters on this most recent election night, and we asked them specifically what their support for a deal would be along the lines that's been reported to be contemplated. One where Iran would be allowed to retain a civilian domestic enrichment capacity in exchange for staged sanctions reductions over time when they meet benchmarks for compliance. We found that 84% of Jewish American voters would support such a deal.
Wow.
Now that seems very much at odds not only with what some pro-Israel groups are telling Congress, but with what a lot of Israeli officials are telling their own people and telling the United States. is there political space, or any kind of space within the Israeli security establishment, including former officials as well as current officials, to support a genuine extension and not try to frustrate it, as the Prime Minister seems to want to, with what he calls additional pressure on Iran?
Yeah, I think most of the Israeli intelligence and defense establishment supports this interim agreement. I think even Bibi Netanyahu supports this interim agreement, which is why there's a contradiction in what he says. On the one hand, he's happy that this interim agreement is being extended and the U.S. hasn't sort of given away the store, as he would put it, in a comprehensive deal. On the other hand, he seems to want to jeopardize it with more sanctions. So I don't quite get the logic of that.
Understood. Just checking to see if we have any more questions at this time. Some might be coming. I
see one big scroll right now. Okay.
Okay. We're getting a number of questions, and you should absolutely feel free to weigh in on this, on who in Congress are likely to be the champions for extending this, or at least trying to reach a deal over the coming months, and who is likely to move against it.
Well,
share any insights you have.
I'm not an expert on the U.S. Congress. I know probably more about the Iranian Majlis than I do about the U.S. Congress. But, you know, Chris Murphy of Connecticut, Chris or Patrick?
Chris,
right, has been very good on this. I've seen statements he's made in support of the administration's diplomacy. You know, the Republicans, Mark Kirk in particular, who has never met a sanction against Iran that he doesn't like. We are hearing also very hawkish comments from Lindsey Graham. You know, we'll see. Haven't heard much, I have to say, from Bob Menendez lately. I don't know where he's going to stand on this when the new Congress comes in. Also, it'd be interesting to see where Bob Corker is. Now, he is the incoming head of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he was rather cautious in his comments after the midterm elections, saying he wanted to wait and see what an agreement would say before he would decide to move for or against it. Now, there is no new agreement. On the one hand, you know, that means there is less of a target for some in Congress, because we know very well that a number of people would not have been satisfied with whatever agreement could have been reached. So they just still have the interim agreement to kick around. They don't have a comprehensive deal. Iran is not going to get the comprehensive sanctions relief that it would have under the larger deal. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they react to this and whether they trim up the works.
Right. One interesting gambit that some of those who are opposed to diplomacy in Congress are contemplating right now is not doing something specifically on the nuclear issue, at least not frontally, but instead addressing Iranian human rights in a way which it's pretty clear from most, not all, of the vehicles that have been proposed or written on this, in a way that is more focused on frustrating the nuclear issue rather than genuinely helping Iranian people and human rights activists. What's your sense from Iranian human rights activists as to whether or not they want Congress to step into their issues right now, or whether they would have them focus on the nuclear issue?
Yeah, the Iranian human rights activists, civil society activists in general, have been very clear that they want a nuclear deal, and that this diplomacy is good for them and relieves pressure. And may I point out that the Iranians have released 2 political prisoners in recent days. One was a British Iranian woman who had gone to a volleyball game and sat with men, which you're not supposed to do, and she was held for a few months. There was also Hossein Darakhshan, who's an Iranian blogger, who was held, excuse me, who was held for 6 years for his blogging activities, and he was released. Now, there are others we'd like to see there. Of course, Jason Rezaian, the correspondent for the Washington Post. There's Saeed Abedini, a Christian pastor. Others who are still being held, Amir Hekmati, an American Iranian Marine, ex-Marine. And I don't know what this means for their fate. I worry about that. But there were some good signs in the lead-up to the negotiations that Iran was improving its human rights record, at least just a little bit. No, this is a bad argument on the part of Congress. Passing the sanctions, trying to use human rights as a way to violate the terms of the interim agreement, that's not going to be helpful.
And how is Hassan Rouhani doing vis-a-vis the hardliners who want to see him taken from power?
Well, this is going to weaken him, the fact that he doesn't have a deal. I worry about that. I really worry about that. It's going to be easier for the hardliners to take pot shots at him. And I worry about Zarif. And I think Rouhani is supposed to be addressing the Iranian people. It may be happening as we speak, and explaining where they are in the negotiations. Zarif will also brief his parliament, and we'll see whether they're able to spin this in such a way that they can suggest that they were holding fast to principle and preserving Iranian rights and Iranian dignity. That might work with the hardliners, but frankly, there are a lot of disappointed and millions of disappointed ordinary Iranians today.
Understood. Very helpful to know. Thank you very much. I think that about wraps up the questions that we've got. Thank you so much, Barbara, for joining us today. I know you have a lot more insights to share with other folks, so we really you have joined us today.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Barbara.